The room fell into a stunned silence. Richard Blackwell, CEO of Titan Enterprises, sat frozen in his sleek, modern office. His once pristine empire was unraveling in front of him. The television screen flickered, broadcasting live coverage of a corporate scandal. His former ally, Adam Lawrence, stood at a press conference, revealing damning evidence of financial misconduct within the company. Richard's grip tightened on the armrest of his chair as his world spun into chaos. His loyal confidant, the CFO, had betrayed him. Adam's voice cut through the airwaves. Titan Enterprises was built on lies, and now the truth is out. The words burned through Richard's chest. He had trusted Adam, had fought beside him to bring Titan to the peak of success. Now his empire was crumbling. Richard slammed his fist on the desk, the anger and disbelief swirling inside him. He had built Titan from the ground up, and now it was being torn apart by the very people he had placed at its heart. "How could I not see it?" he muttered to himself, staring blankly at the screen. The stocks were plummeting, and the investors were pulling out. His empire was collapsing. The world he knew was fading away, and all that remained was a shattered reflection of the man he had once been. Richard's steps echoed through the empty corridors of Titan Enterprises. The once vibrant hallways now felt cold and abandoned. The company he had built from the ground up had always been his pride and joy, but now it was unraveling before his eyes. The sleek modern walls that once symbolized progress and success now felt hollow, the lights flickering overhead like the last vestiges of hope. The boardroom doors loomed ahead, the place where he had fought countless battles, made monumental deals, and built Titan's empire. But now, as he walked down the silent hallway, he felt like a ghost in his own creation. His trusted allies had turned their backs on him. His closest confidants, including Adam, had betrayed him in the cruelest way. Every inch of the office now felt like a reminder of what he had lost. The silence was deafening, and Richard could hear the distant murmurs of the employees behind closed doors, whispers of uncertainty and fear. As he reached the boardroom, Richard stopped. He stared at the large glass doors and felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The very company he had worked so hard to build was on the verge of collapse. But he knew one thing: he would not go down without a fight. Richard entered the boardroom, a vast space with polished marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city below. He stood by the long oval table that had once seen heated discussions and power moves. Now, it felt lifeless. His mind raced with thoughts of betrayal, regret, and anger. The city outside, bathed in the fading light of dusk, looked peaceful and serene. It felt like a cruel contrast to the storm raging inside him. Richard ran a hand through his hair, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He had trusted Adam Lawrence, built Titan Enterprises with him, and now everything was crashing down. Richard's gaze drifted to the empty chairs around the boardroom table. Once, those seats had been filled with powerful figures who shared his vision, but now they stood as a reminder of all he had lost. He felt like a man trapped in a glass box, with no way out. As the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, Richard knew this was only the beginning of his downfall. But he also knew that he couldn't give up. Not yet. Richard's phone buzzed. He picked it up and saw the name of his loyal confidant, Claudia Evans, flashing on the screen. Claudia had been with him from the beginning, and her voice, calm yet filled with concern, was the only source of comfort in the chaos. "Richard, we need to talk," she said, her words heavy with urgency. "The board is calling an emergency meeting. They're pushing for your resignation." Richard's heart sank. The walls were closing in faster than he had anticipated. "I'll be there," he replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. He hung up and took a deep breath. This was it, the moment when he would either fight to save everything he had built or watch it all slip away. Richard knew that he couldn't let the company fall without a battle. He had one final chance to reclaim control, to prove that he still had the strength to lead. But first, he had to face the people who once called him a friend. the people who would now be his greatest adversaries. With a steadying breath, Richard left the boardroom, ready to face the storm that awaited him. Richard walked into the emergency board meeting, his presence commanding attention even as the murmurs of uncertainty filled the room. Every seat around the large oval table was occupied by members of the board, each one casting a skeptical eye toward him. Claudia Evans, his closest ally, sat at his side, her face a mask of determination. Richard's gaze swept across the room, landing on the faces of those who once admired him. Now, they looked at him as if he were a failure. As he stood at the head of the table, he knew that his survival in this room depended on his ability to control the narrative. "I built this company," he began, his voice steady and firm, "and I will not let it fall without a fight." There was a tense silence as Richard looked into the eyes of his adversaries, knowing that his every word would decide his fate. Richard sat in his dimly lit office, the city skyline glowing faintly beyond the glass wall. He barely noticed the sound of the door opening. A familiar voice, warm yet distant, broke the silence. "It's been a long time, Richard." He turned to see Sarah Lancaster, mid-40s, elegant but understated, standing in the doorway. Her expression was unreadable, a mix of nostalgia and caution. Memories flooded back, the late nights building dreams, the laughter, the closeness that had once been theirs. "I never thought I'd see you again," Richard said, his voice low. Sarah stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the floor. "I heard about the scandal. I had to see for myself if the man I knew was still here." Richard's gaze met hers, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through his guarded exterior. "That man is gone," he murmured. She studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching for truth. "Maybe not entirely," she said softly, her words lingering in the charged air between them. They sat across from each other now, the desk between them feeling like a chasm. Sarah's eyes scanned his face, noting the lines carved by stress and ambition. "You built an empire, Richard, but at what cost?" she asked. Her tone wasn't accusatory, it was almost mournful. Richard leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Everything has a price. I paid mine." She folded her hands in her lap, her fingers tightening slightly. "I walked away because I saw where this road would take you." The words cut deeper than he expected. He wanted to defend himself, to argue that it had all been worth it, but the weight of recent events pressed down on him. "You were right," he admitted quietly. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the city below. Sarah's gaze softened. "Then maybe this is your chance to find another way." Her words stirred something inside him, something he thought was long dead. Sarah reached into her leather bag and placed a folder on the desk. "I didn't come here to reminisce. I came with an offer." Richard eyed the folder suspiciously. "What kind of offer?" She met his gaze, her expression resolute. "A chance to save Titan and yourself." He hesitated before opening it. Inside were detailed plans for a strategic acquisition, one that could outmaneuver his enemies and restore stability. "Why would you help me?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Because despite everything, I still believe you can be more than this, if you choose to be." The words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Richard closed the folder slowly, his mind racing. This could be the lifeline he needed, but he knew nothing came without strings. "What's the catch?" he asked, his voice low. Sarah's eyes glinted in the dim light. "The catch, Richard, is that you'll have to trust me again." The air in the office grew heavier as Richard considered the implications. Aligning with Sarah again meant reopening old wounds, and exposing himself to risks he wasn't sure he could control. "You're asking me to gamble what little I have left," he said. She didn't flinch. "You've always been a gambler. The difference is, this time you might win back more than money." Richard studied her, searching for any hint of deception. Instead, he found the same unwavering confidence she'd always carried. "If I say yes, I'm all in," he warned. Sarah's lips curved into the faintest smile. "That's the only way you've ever played." For the first time in days, a spark of resolve ignited in him. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe it was the start of a different kind of fight. As Sarah left the building, her heels clicking against the marble lobby floor, a figure watched from the shadows. Marcus Kane, the manipulative rival CEO, stood partially concealed near a column, his sharp eyes following her every move. He had been tipped off about her meeting with Richard, and now the pieces were falling into place. A slow, calculating smile spread across his face. So, the ghost from his past returns, he murmured to himself. His mind already worked through how he could turn this alliance to his advantage, or destroy it before it began. Sarah stepped into a waiting car, unaware of his presence. Marcus pulled out his phone and sent a brief, cryptic message. "He's in play." The game had just become far more dangerous. Richard sat in the strategy room with Claudia and Sarah, their faces lit by the glow of projected market data. "Marcus is moving fast," Claudia said, pointing to the chart. "He's positioning for a hostile takeover." Richard's jaw tightened. "Then we hit first." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes locked on him. "We can acquire Ridgewell tech before he does. It'll give you the leverage to force him into a stalemate." Richard hesitated, weighing the risk. "If we fail, it's over." Claudia met his gaze. "If we don't try, it's over anyway." The hum of the projector filled the silence. Richard finally nodded. "Do it. Tonight." The decision was made, but the war had only just begun. Marcus Kane's office was a fortress of glass and steel, perched high above the city. He stood by the window, speaking into a phone. "They're making a move on Ridgewell? Good. I want them to think they're ahead." His voice was calm, almost amused. Across his desk, a young associate took notes nervously. "Sir, should we intercept the bid?" Marcus smiled faintly. "No, we let them commit. Then we pull the floor out from under them." He ended the call and poured a glass of whiskey. "Richard always plays to win. He forgets I play to destroy." In a private conference suite, Richard, Sarah, and Claudia met with Ridgewell's CEO, Eleanor Briggs. The tension was palpable. "You understand," Eleanor said. "This offer must remain confidential." Richard nodded. "It will be. You have my word." Sarah slid a revised contract across the table. "If you sign tonight, we can close before Marcus even reacts." Eleanor studied the papers, her expression unreadable. Finally, she picked up the pen. "You're gambling big, Blackwell." Richard gave a faint smile. "It's the only way I know how to play." Elsewhere, Adam Lawrence met quietly with Marcus in a shadowed bar. "They think they're moving in secret," Adam said, sliding a folder across the table. Marcus opened it, revealing details of Richard's bid. "You've been thorough," Marcus remarked. Adam leaned back, sipping his drink. "I told you, Richard doesn't see me coming." Marcus's smile was cold. "Then let's make sure he never does." Outside, rain streaked the windows, blurring the neon lights beyond. Back in his office, Richard reviewed the Ridgewell deal documents when Claudia burst in. "Marcus knows," she said breathlessly. Richard looked up sharply. "How?" Her silence was answer enough. "Betrayal. Again." He stood, anger coursing through him. "Find out who leaked it." Sarah entered moments later, reading the tension instantly. "We're running out of time," she warned. Richard straightened, his resolve hardening. "Then we move faster. Before he takes everything." Richard had just finished a tense phone call with Ridgewell's CEO when Claudia stormed into the office. "The board has just pulled the plug on the Ridgewell acquisition," she said, her voice edged with frustration. "They're blaming us for the leak. They say it came from inside." Richard's mind raced. Marcus has to be behind this. Someone must have tipped him off. He clenched his jaw. "Find out who it was." Claudia hesitated. "I don't think we can trust anyone here anymore, Richard. We're surrounded by spies." He looked at her, his expression cold and calculating. "I don't care. This isn't over." His fists slammed down onto the desk, his face twisted with anger. "I'll make sure Marcus feels the heat. He's going to regret underestimating me." The game had shifted, and Richard was ready to take the gloves off. Marcus Kane sat in his luxurious penthouse office, his fingers tracing the rim of a whiskey glass. Adam Lawrence stood by the window, watching the city lights below. "Richard thinks he's still in control," Marcus said with a smirk. "But he's already lost. We've got Ridgewell, and Titan is on the brink." Adam looked out, his face unreadable. "And what about the board?" he asked quietly. Marcus chuckled darkly. "They'll come around. They always do. Once we control Ridgewell, Titan becomes ours for the taking." Adam didn't respond. He was used to Marcus's arrogance, but this time, something felt different. Marcus was playing a dangerous game, and Adam wasn't sure what the end would look like. "It's almost too easy," Marcus said, raising his glass in a mock toast. "I'll make Richard Blackwell wish he'd never crossed me." Richard paced back and forth in the war room, the weight of the betrayal heavy on his chest. "We have to find out who's behind this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Claudia nodded, her expression tight with worry. "We're running out of time." The board's already leaning toward Marcus. "The Ridgewell deal is just the beginning." Richard's fists clenched. "I won't let him take everything I've built. I'm not finished yet." Sarah entered the room, her face grave. "Richard, it's worse than you think." He stopped and looked at her, his heart sinking. "What now?" Sarah handed him a file. "There's a leak, and it's closer to home than you realize. Your own CFO is feeding Marcus information." The shock of the revelation hit like a punch to the gut. Richard's world was crumbling, and the people he trusted the most were the ones stabbing him in the back. Richard's office was silent, save for the hum of the city below. He sat at his desk, staring at the file Sarah had given him, his mind reeling. The name of the CFO, Thomas Wright, burned in his eyes. He had been loyal, or so Richard thought. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Claudia entered, her face clouded with concern. "We need to talk," she said. "I've been digging into this, and it's worse than we thought. Marcus has already started to dismantle the company from the inside." Richard's heart pounded as he realized the scope of the situation. "Where do we go from here?" he asked, his voice strained. Claudia hesitated. "We fight back. We can't afford to back down now." Richard leaned back in his chair, his face hardening with resolve. "Then we take the fight to Marcus. No more games." The boardroom was filled with the murmurs of uncertainty. Richard stood at the head of the table, facing a room full of his former allies. "You're all looking at the wrong enemy," he said, his voice steady, but filled with fire. "Marcus Kane isn't the future of Titan. I am." The room went silent. Richard's gaze swept across the board members, including Claudia and Sarah, who stood by his side. "You're being manipulated by fear, and you're too blind to see it." His words rang out like a challenge. "I'm taking back control, and I'll show you just how much you've underestimated me." A sudden knock at the door interrupted the tense silence. Thomas Wright, the CFO, entered, his expression unreadable. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Richard knew this would be the moment that decided everything. Richard sat alone in his office, the storm clouds outside mirroring the turmoil inside. He had made the decision. This was the final move, the confrontation he'd been preparing for. Marcus had played every card he had, but now it was Richard's turn. His fingers drummed lightly on the desk as he reviewed the final strategy. "It's all or nothing," he muttered to himself. He picked up his phone and dialed Sarah. "We meet with Marcus tomorrow. I want everything on the table. No more games." His voice was cold, his resolve firm. Claudia entered, her face a mixture of concern and determination. "You're sure about this?" she asked. Richard didn't look up, his eyes locked on the plan in front of him. "This ends tomorrow," he said, his tone final. Sarah's voice crackled over the line. "I'll be ready. But Richard, you know this could change everything, right?" He smiled grimly. "I know." The next day, Richard entered the boardroom with Sarah and Claudia by his side. The tension was palpable. Marcus sat at the head of the table, his usual smug expression replaced with a calculated seriousness. You've been making a lot of moves, Blackwell, Marcus said, his voice smooth. Richard didn't flinch. You've been making a lot of mistakes, he replied coldly. The room fell silent, the stakes clear to everyone present. Marcus' eyes narrowed. You think you can take me down with a few tricks? He scoffed. Richard's gaze never wavered. I don't need tricks, I need what's mine. He placed a folder on the table, revealing the evidence of Marcus's manipulation, a trail of corporate espionage and underhanded tactics. You've been playing dirty. It ends now. The weight of the moment hung in the air as the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. You think you've won? He sneered. You're just as much a part of this game as I am, Blackwell. Richard's jaw tightened, his anger rising. I never wanted this, but I will finish it. The two men stood face to face, the air thick with animosity. You're weak, Richard. You always have been. You never knew how to play this game for keeps, Marcus spat. Richard's gaze was unwavering. I'm not playing anymore. He turned to Sarah, who stood beside him, her eyes filled with determination. It's time to take back what's ours. The sound of a door opening interrupted the moment. Adam Lawrence entered the room, his face a mask of indifference. I've been waiting for this, he said coldly. Let's see who really controls Titan. Richard and Marcus exchanged one last, furious glance before Richard stepped forward, slamming a folder onto the table. You wanted a fight, Marcus? You've got one. He handed the folder to the board members, the contents a legal challenge that would invalidate Marcus's acquisitions and expose his illegal activities. The board members hesitated, their faces shifting from apprehension to realization. You can't win, Richard, Marcus said, his voice low and threatening. This isn't over. Richard met his gaze without flinching. It is now. The room erupted into chaos as the board members began to whisper among themselves. Sarah stood beside Richard, her eyes fixed on Marcus. You've lost, she said quietly. Marcus's face twisted in rage. We'll see about that, he snarled, storming out of the room. Richard didn't move, his eyes locked on the door as Marcus disappeared. The news spread quickly. Titan Enterprises was officially under Richard's control again. Marcus was out, his empire crumbling with him. But as Richard stood in his office, looking out over the city, he felt no victory, only exhaustion. Sarah entered, standing beside him silently. You did it, she said softly. It's over. Richard didn't answer immediately, his gaze lost in the sprawling city below. I didn't win anything. I lost more than I ever realized. Sarah turned to him, her voice gentle. You did what you had to do. He nodded slowly. But at what cost? Richard glanced at the skyline one last time before turning away. I'll rebuild. But it won't be the same. It never is. As Sarah stood by his side, Richard knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where the ghosts of his past would never fully fade. The city was quiet for the first time in weeks. Richard stood in his office, looking out at the skyline, the weight of everything that had happened settling in. The victory over Marcus was hollow, and the cost was heavy. The once glamorous empire he had fought for was now just a shadow of its former self. Sarah stood beside him, her presence a silent reassurance. I never thought it would end like this, Richard muttered, his voice filled with quiet sorrow. I've lost so much. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. But you haven't lost yourself. Richard turned to her, his expression torn. I'm not sure who I am anymore. She met his gaze. You're still the man who built this company, the one who fought for it. That hasn't changed. Richard looked back at the city. I've changed. Everything has. Silence stretched between them as Richard contemplated the future. What now? He finally asked. Now we rebuild, Sarah replied. Richard and Sarah sat in a small quiet cafe across town, the weight of their conversation almost too heavy to bear. You're not alone in this, Richard, Sarah said, her voice steady but soft. You never were. Richard looked down at his coffee, the steam rising in gentle swirls. I feel like I've pushed everyone away. Marcus, Adam. They all know how to play the game. I've been too honest, too trusting. Sarah shook her head. Honesty isn't a weakness, and neither is trust. Richard looked up at her, his expression hardening. I've trusted the wrong people, Sarah. Look at where it's gotten me. Sarah's eyes softened. We all make mistakes, but it's how we move forward that defines us. Richard sighed, his shoulders heavy with regret. I don't know where to begin. She smiled gently. We start small, one step at a time. Weeks passed. Richard spent his days meeting with key members of Titan Enterprises, slowly rebuilding the company from the ground up. The scars of the past still lingered, but with every meeting, with every decision, Richard felt the weight on his shoulders grow lighter. He had begun to trust again, but cautiously. You've done it, Richard, Claudia said, her voice filled with respect as she walked into his office. Titan is on track. The investors are coming back. Richard looked at her, his expression a mix of exhaustion and relief. It's not just me, it's the team. Claudia smiled. You're leading them, Richard. That's what matters. Richard paused, his mind wandering to the future. But will it ever be the same? He asked quietly. Claudia sat across from him. It doesn't have to be the same. It just has to be better. Richard's day took an unexpected turn when Adam Lawrence walked into his office, his expression a mix of defiance and something else, regret. I came to see you, Richard, Adam said, his voice tentative. I owe you an apology. Richard looked up, surprise flashing in his eyes. You owe me more than an apology, Adam. Adam nodded, stepping further into the room. I know. I betrayed you. And I know there's no excuse for what I did. But I've spent the last few weeks thinking about everything. About what I've lost. Richard didn't respond immediately. I know you're angry, but I'm trying to make it right. I want to help rebuild Titan. I want to be part of the solution. Richard stared at him, his expression hard. Why now, Adam? Why come back? Adam looked down. Because I see the man you've become, and I see the man I could have been if I hadn't taken the easy way out. Richard stood at the edge of the balcony, the wind ruffling his hair as he gazed out at the city below. It had been a long road to this moment, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, he knew that this was just the beginning. I'm not the same man I was before, Richard said quietly. Sarah stepped up beside him, her presence comforting. You've come a long way. Richard nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. I've lost a lot, but I've gained something too. I've learned that the fight isn't just about power or control, it's about what you do with it. Sarah smiled softly. And what will you do with it? Richard turned to her, his expression calm but determined. I'll build something better, something worth fighting for. As the last rays of sunlight bathed the city in golden light, Richard felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was finally on the right path. Titan Enterprises had been rebuilt, but it wasn't the same. Richard stood in front of the company's iconic logo, his heart heavy with the weight of everything he had sacrificed. The walls that once symbolized success now felt like they contained his regrets. He had faced betrayal, loss, and redemption, but the price of ambition was high, and he wondered if it had all been worth it. Sarah entered quietly, standing beside him as he gazed at the logo. You've brought it back, Richard, she said, her voice soft but filled with pride. Richard exhaled slowly, his eyes lingering on the logo that once represented the pinnacle of his career. I brought it back, but at what cost? He asked, his voice tinged with melancholy. Sarah looked at him, understanding. The price is always high, but it doesn't have to define you. Richard nodded slowly. I think it already has. He turned to Sarah. It's time to decide, Sarah. What kind of man will I be from now on? Richard sat in his office late into the night, the weight of his decisions pressing on him. He had always been a man of action, someone who pushed forward no matter the cost. But now, he felt the weight of his choices more acutely than ever. I've rebuilt everything, he whispered to himself. But what have I lost in the process? The door creaked open, and Claudia stepped in, her face calm yet concerned. "You've made it through the worst of it, Richard. Titan is stronger than ever." Richard shook his head. "Strength isn't everything, Claudia. I've alienated everyone who mattered to me." Claudia sat across from him, her voice steady. "You can't go back and change the past, but you can choose what you do with the future." Richard looked up, his eyes searching her face. "Do you think I still have a future, Claudia?" She smiled softly. "If you want one, it's yours for the taking." The following morning, Richard walked into the boardroom. The air was thick with expectation. As he stood at the head of the table, the board members looked at him, waiting for him to speak. Richard's eyes swept across the room, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of clarity. "I've been to the edge and back," he began, his voice steady. "I've made mistakes and I've paid for them. But I'm here today to tell you that Titan Enterprises can be more than what it's been." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "We can be a company that doesn't just profit. We can make a difference." The room was silent, but the shift in the air was palpable. One by one, the board members exchanged glances. Sarah, standing at the back of the room, smiled slightly. Richard had finally found his purpose again. As Richard walked through the newly renovated office floor, he could feel the energy of the place shift. Employees moved with purpose, their eyes filled with renewed hope. The company was no longer just about wealth. It was about something deeper. Richard paused at a window, watching as the sun set over the city. It had taken everything he had to get here. "We've made it," he said quietly to Sarah, who had joined him by the window. "No," she replied, her voice filled with a quiet certainty. "We've just begun." Richard turned to look at her, his face softening. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm ready to lead differently now." Sarah smiled. "You've always been a leader, Richard. Now you'll lead with a purpose." Richard looked out at the city one last time. "Then let's make it count." Richard stood at the edge of the balcony, the vast city stretching out before him. The chaos of the past seemed distant now, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. He had fought hard for this, for the chance to rebuild and to lead with integrity. As Sarah joined him on the balcony, she stood beside him in silence for a moment, both of them watching the city below. Finally, Richard spoke. "I've learned that success isn't measured by what you have, but by what you can give." Sarah nodded. "And what will you give, Richard?" He smiled, the weight of the years lifting off his shoulders. "I'll give everything I have to make this company something worth believing in." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a final golden light over the city. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Richard felt ready for whatever it would bring.